Hi, I'm Kaylin O'Connor. I'm an associate professor at UC Irvine in logic and philosophy of science. I do work that's interdisciplinary between philosophy and some of the sciences like economics and biology. And in particular, recently I've done a lot of research on misinformation, on how beliefs and knowledge spread from person to person in societies, and how that social spread of information shapes the things we all believe and why sometimes we believe false things.
And I'm Jim Weatherall. I'm a professor of logic and philosophy of science at UC Irvine. And Kaylin and I together co-authored a book called The Misinformation Age, How False Beliefs Spread. And we co-administer an NSF grant on consensus, democracy, and the public understanding of science that pursues some of the research questions that we began working on with that book. So one of the issues that we discuss in the book, and something that we've worked on since, is the way in which some people do in various organizations, take legitimate science, real research produced by scientists who are using good methods and doing everything right, and turn it into a form of misinformation that can be particularly difficult to identify for ordinary people, and particularly persuasive.
I mean, one thing we see when we look at the history of industrial manipulation of public beliefs is there are a lot of cases where various industries want to shape what members of the public believe, and then they employ a bunch of different techniques to try to do that. And some of those techniques, for example, involve things that look like fraud, paying a scientist to perform studies that then maybe the results are shifted a little bit in industry favor. And other things don't look like that and are much more subtle and tricky and harder to identify. And in particular, take advantage of the norms of science and the norms of the way people create and share information with each other. Like, we don't lie to each other, we trust each other. So for example, one thing that the tobacco company did in the middle of the last century was to look for scientific studies that happened not to find a link between tobacco and cancer, because evidence is probabilistic and some studies out of many, many studies will fail to find such a link. And then they would spread those really widely and say, here are a bunch of real legitimate scientists who aren't finding this link. Therefore, you should doubt that there actually is a link between tobacco and cancer. Another thing you see industry doing is directing attention away from sort of problematic things about their product. So tobacco did this, for instance, by funding research on asbestos and the link between asbestos and lung cancer. And then if someone is trying to sue them to say smoking gave me lung cancer, they can get a real expert to come in and say, well, asbestos causes lung cancer too. So we're not sure what the cause of all this increase in lung cancer is. You see that with climate change and direction towards things like the dangers of windmills to bird species. Well, windmills do kill some birds, but of course, the public health risks of the deaths of these various bird species is absolutely nothing compared to the public health risks of climate change. And so this is a kind of misdirection where you're trying to get people to pay attention to something else.
So a lot of what we see and what we think of as misinformation related to vaccines, some of it is just made up. Some of it is conspiracy theorizing. But some of it is taking real studies and misinterpreting them, taking them out of context, or spreading them as if they're the only piece of information available. And when you do that, when you take individual studies, or you take individual remarks or comments by, a single doctor, small groups of doctors who have, non-mainstream opinions, you can create the impression that there's much more uncertainty about something. In this case, much more uncertainty about the safety and efficacy of the COVID vaccine than there really is. There's an overwhelming, now population level data, right? Millions and millions of people around the world have taken these vaccines, and we have a lot of information about the rate of side effects, the efficacy under various circumstances, and so on. And the case for their safety and efficacy is now very, very strong. And yet, you can point to individual cases, individuals, people who died after taking the vaccine, people who had bad side effects, and out of context, try to create the impression that there's a big problem here. So it's a similar kind of pattern of taking legitimate science or taking real events and manipulating them in a way that changes how people react to them, that we see with industry propaganda, for instance, the tobacco industry.
So, who decides to wear a mask versus not wear a mask? Who decides to social distance versus not social distance? Who decides to get vaccinated versus not vaccinated? All of this has turned out to be deeply dependent on what sorts of social groups people are part of, and in particular, their political identity groups. So conservatives have been much more resistant to masking and vaccination than liberals have. Liberals have taken the dangers of COVID much more seriously than conservatives have. And in part, there are a number of things going on here. At part, it has to do with what sorts of information you're getting. Are the people around you saying things like, well, the vaccines might be dangerous? Masking is like wearing a muzzle. Are they saying things like COVID could really kill you? But also it's about signaling your group identity, showing I am part of this group. This is my social group by putting a mask on or putting a mask off, by getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated. We're hearing stories, for example, of people who want to get vaccinated and decide to wear a disguise or do it secretly so that no one in their social group knows they did it. So they're trying to, take an action, but still signal that they're part of a social group where that action is unacceptable.